Hi, I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, with your update for Day 25 of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. Okay, a lot of exciting stuff from today. We heard from four witnesses actually. First, there was a panel of three from Finance Canada, followed by Jody Thomas, who's the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. So starting off with the panel, it was comprised of the Deputy Minister of Finance, Michael Sabia, and two Assistant Deputy Ministers. The Assistant Deputy Minister of the Financial Sector Policy Division, named Isabelle Jacques, and the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Economic Policy Branch, Reese Mendez. Overall, their testimony centered around two main topics, the one being the impact to Canada's economy and the other being the Emergency Economic Measure Order, which is one of the powers that was, or one of the sets of regulations passed under the Emergencies Act, which related, put simply, it related to the freezing of bank accounts. I'm going to focus on that because that's the Justice Center's focus at these hearings. There were several parties that cross-examined on the nature of these powers and how they were used. A few of the highlights, one came from the way that the power was actually used. So it came out in their testimony that they explained, well, this power was never intended to be used for small donors. It was meant to be used to deter protesters. However, as I think it came out in the evidence, and it's certainly the case on the face of the regulations, that's not how they actually applied. So the way the regulations worked is that they put a duty on banks to cease all dealings, which amounts to freezing bank accounts, of any designated persons. And designated persons were people who were doing committing something listed under sections 2, 3, 4, or 5 under the emergency regulations. And under those, that conduct relates to people who are attending what was identified as an unlawful gathering, but it included people who provide material support, which would capture donors. So it actually put an obligation on banks to freeze the bank accounts of donors, even though perhaps that's not what was intended. They were also cross-examined on the consequences that this imposed on people. Suji Chowdhury from the Canadian Constitution Foundation basically went after that point, pointing out that freezing people's bank accounts has long-term impacts beyond just the actual declaration of emergency. For example, if someone's bank account is frozen and then they can't make certain payments that they're obligated to make, that's going to show up on their credit score, and then that's going to affect their ability to get other loans down the line. In terms of people's joint bank accounts, it also affects their family members, like their wives or husbands or spouse, that's out, not at the protest. It affects their ability to make payments for the necessities of life. And when asked about that, the panel's answer was essentially that it wasn't their focus. Their focus was on deterring conduct. Another highlight, or perhaps a broader point from their testimony, was that the emergency economic measures had two goals. One was to prevent the flow of donations to the protesters, and the other was to put pressure on protesters by deterring them. With respect to the first point, one of the subjects of my cross-examination was that was already done. Their accounts were frozen. For example, the Attorney General of Ontario had obtained a restraint order against restraining funds that were held in the accounts holding the donations, and it also applied to Give, Send, Go, for example. Another big point was what role the banks had in this. So the panel testified that the intention was that the banks have a discretion, but then Commission counsel asked them a series of questions relating to what the RCMP actually provided to banks, and the form that was provided used the phrase, or to the effect that the person identified was engaged in the behavior that was identified by the emergency regulations. And so, given the duty that the emergency economic measures placed on placed on protesters, it's like Isabelle Jacques agreed that, if she were in the financial institution shoes, she would probably just go ahead and freeze the account. The other witness that we heard from was Jody Thomas, who's the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. The big thing coming out of her testimony is essentially that although she contests the definition of what's required under the Emergencies Act, in substance she agreed that the underlying issues weren't there. So my colleague Rob Kittredge asked her a line of questions going through what is actually required. And so she argued about her ability as a non-lawyer to actually answer what is required under the Emergencies Act. But the Emergencies Act says that an emergency involves a situation with threats to the security of Canada, as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And Section 2 of the CSIS Act lists 4 options. And she agreed that those things weren't present. So, for example, it was put to her option C, which relates to acts or threats of acts of serious violence to persons or property. And she asked what serious violence. She asked what the definition of serious violence was, or said it depends on the definition. Mr. Kittredge asked her what violence was there. She said it was continuing throughout the protest, but then when pressed, she gave examples such as honking, fumes, potentially people being harassed in the streets, but essentially the things that we've already heard from police officers and residents. But certainly not serious violence. And she also explained that the definition she was using was broader than Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which is not what's required by the Emergencies Act. So given that so far Ms. Thomas is the high point in terms of a supporting voice for the use of the Emergencies Act, this is powerful evidence that's going to be impactful on the findings at the end of the day. That's the update for today. There won't be an update tomorrow, so tune in on Monday for the next update that I do. Thanks, and I'll talk to you then.